3 years ago, with several other people of faith, I participated in civil disobedience protesting the pipeline being built in West Roxbury, a neighborhood of Boston. We were, some of us, arrested, and shortly thereafter we appeared in a Boston courtroom. Up front in the courtroom, to the side wall, along the side where the judge was sitting, there were 3 framed portraits. One was George Washington, another was Abraham Lincoln, and the 3rd framed portrait was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This struck me as very strange, because Martin Luther King was not, in his lifetime, on the framed photo side of the judicial system, up by the judge. King was on the other side of the system again and again, doing civil disobedience again and again, being arrested again and again. How strange to see his framed photo there in court, in a location that implied that he was part of the law and order side of things in the judicial system, when he spent so much of his life talking about a law higher than the flawed laws of humanity. More than a half a century since his assassination, we still remember Martin Luther King, each year in January especially. You would think, based on the way that he's celebrated on his holiday each year, praised by people from all sorts of political persuasions, you would think that he was a very beloved American indeed while he lived. You would think, based on the things that are remembered about him in the public sphere, that he was revered, almost like the presidents that we think of as the great presidents of the United States at the time of his death. He even has a monument in Washington, D.C. now, like those presidents that we think of as great. But what did America think of Martin Luther King while he was alive? According to a Gallup poll in 1963, taken shortly before the famous March on Washington, 77% of Americans had a less than favorable opinion of that upcoming demonstration. Closer to the time of his death, when King passionately opposed the U.S. war in Vietnam, and when he started to spend more and more time talking about his dream of ending poverty, at this time, a poll was taken that showed 72% of white Americans disapproved of his stances on Vietnam and eradicating poverty. And at the time of his death, 55% of black Americans disapproved of his opposition to the war and his work to end poverty. When Martin Luther King is remembered in civic events today, the focus is usually on his work for civil rights and fighting racism. And he had some amazing successes in those areas that are worth celebrating. But scarcely is there mention that he was anti-war, anti-militarism, and in favor of a radical redistribution of wealth. As Harvard professor and public intellectual Cornel West notes in the introduction to his book, The Radical King, the FBI and the U.S. government considered King to be, quote, the most dangerous man in America. They thought he was dangerous because of his revolutionary Christian views. The FBI surveilled and recorded him relentlessly. They sent him an anonymous and threatening letter that King and many others believed was meant to drive him to suicide. Some believe that the government was involved in a conspiracy that ultimately led to his death. It's not clear whether or not that is true, but many in power were no doubt glad when he was gone. King was indeed a radical. He was truly a revolutionary Christian. In the tradition of Jesus, he espoused nonviolence consistently, And also in the tradition of Jesus, he was anti-empire, anti-US imperialism. If we take King's vision of what America should be seriously, the challenge is steep. King's call to justice made him live life that was so dangerously radical, such an outspoken life, that he actually expected to die an untimely, violent death. And like Jesus, indeed, he never made it to see 40. The more I thought about it this past week, the more I thought that it actually makes sense to remember Martin Luther King near his death date, as we're doing today, because it often falls this time of year, which is during Lent and close to Easter. As Cornel West put it, for King, the scandal of the cross is the way of the world. For those who pursue radical love, the cross may be the only dwelling place. And so today, during this Lenten season of King's own Christian tradition, it's appropriate to remember that it's up to us to resurrect Martin Luther King's dreams, his full dream, and to bring it to life. By 1967, a year before his death, King talked regularly about the three evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. These three evils are ultimately all different facets of materialism and greed. King said, "The time has come for America to face the inevitable choice between materialism and humanism. We must devote at least as much to our children's education and to the health of the poor as we do the care of our automobiles and the building of beautiful, impressive hotels. We must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power." The FBI thought of King as a communist. He wasn't. He wasn't a Marxist, nor, however, was he a capitalist. He saw capitalism as being as flawed as communism. King thought that Marxism failed to see the importance of the individual aspects of life, but he thought that capitalism failed to see the importance of the collective aspects of life. He wrote, "Capitalism fails to realize that life is social. Communism fails to realize that life is personal. The good and just society is neither the thesis of capitalism nor the antithesis of communism, but a socially conscious democracy which reconciles the truths of individualism and collectivism." King was, in fact, a democratic socialist, wanting to synthesize the best of capitalism and the best of socialism. He did, in fact, want a radical redistribution. He said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." Part of what is so challenging about remembering the radical Martin Luther King is that he wasn't just preaching about Christian ideals like charity and love in the abstract. He was saying that we should do something about poverty and violence, and that we could. In this sense, you could say he was almost more radical than Jesus. Jesus said, "The poor you will always have with you." Jesus cared about the poor, but he did not in his lifetime see a way to solve poverty. It was beyond his imaginings. But King's last major project in his lifetime was the Poor People's Campaign, and it wasn't just metaphorical. He believed that an all-out metaphorical war on poverty could be literally won. He wrote, "There is nothing new about poverty. What is new, however, is that we now have the resources to get rid of it. America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There's nothing to prevent us from paying adequate wages to school teachers, social workers, and other servants of the public to ensure that we have the best available personnel in these positions, which are charged with the responsibility of guiding our future generations. He said there is nothing but lack of social vision to prevent us from paying an adequate wage to every American citizen, whether he be a hospital worker, laundry worker, maid, or day laborer. There is nothing, he said, except short-sightedness to prevent us from guaranteeing an annual minimum and livable income for every American family. The kind of positive revolution of values is our best defense against communism, said King. Today, I'm sure King would say that there is nothing but lack of social vision to prevent us from making Medicare for all a reality. Nothing but lack of social vision to prevent us from making college education free to the public. Nothing but lack of social vision to prevent us from creating a new green economy where sustainability rules, not the false dream of endless growth. King said, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. King's full dream for the United States of America requires a deep, profound cultural creativity as we restructure the way we think about our society. In this context, less than a year before he was killed, King said, America, you must be born again. Let us remember this Martin Luther King, who is too often forgotten. Let us keep his full dream alive. May we challenge ourselves to live a life of radical love. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.